That's really helpful. and it fits so well with what I want to share today. I want to talk with you all about briefly here this morning. And we're thinking about this idea of sin and the 7 deadly sins. And what I'm trying to kind of help us get to or to start seeing is the virtue that is often at the heart of these sins. Because the big challenge for us, I think, for me, for all of us, I think, is as we become more and more conscious, as we become more and more aware of our reality, as we wake up to things as opposed to being dead in bed, not knowing that the other folks are dead with us in bed, I never realized just how profound that silly song was. Yeah, I used to sing that at elementary schools, and teachers come up and talk about how evil I was. And I was like, no, there's a profound philosophical concept. Anyway, we're learning how to wake up, right? That's the whole idea. So when we learn to wake up, a lot of that has to do with recognizing this duality that we fall into. It's impossible not to. It's the way our bodies are designed, the way our neurology is designed. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we end up doing that all the time in terms of greed, but also what is being invited in these moments when we experience these things. So I'll start off, I want to share a quick story. Speaking of Ireland and St. Patrick's, I'll do a few of St. Patrick's things today, you can imagine. But I was telling stories at a zoo benefit in St. Louis. I'd been invited to be a storyteller at this benefit with the board, the zoo board, and so it was some of the wealthier folks of the city, as well as some of those really committed people to animal rights, and those folks who worked in the nitty-gritty with the zoo. They were all part of the board and their friends. There were a couple of hundred people total. And I think it was going great. It was a fun evening, and everybody was enjoying it, and it was all about fun and humor and working together. And then I finished up with this blessing, which I thought was also going to be fun. It was an old Irish blessing. And it said, "May the Lord always be with you. May those who love you, may the Lord warm their hearts too, that they might love you more. And that those who do not love you, may the Lord find them and also warm their hearts so that even they too will find warmth and love for you. But if their hearts be not warmed, then may the Lord twist their ankles so you could at least know your enemies by their limping." And the crowd laughed for about 2 seconds. And then it went silent as the board director came limping across the floor with his prosthetic leg and his cane and made his way up onto the stage and then kind of looked at me with a bit of a slanted smile. And I smiled and said, "Am I still getting paid?" Because that's all I could think of. And I quickly got off the stage and wanted to do one of those things where you're like, "I'm sorry, I ruined the whole thing. It was a great evening," until I got up there and said something. And I kind of disappeared afterwards. Funny thing about that day, that's all I remember. I was there for an hour. I told stories. They all laughed. The only thing I remember was the faux pas at the end and the extreme sense of awkwardness that I felt after that. The idea that we experience sin as a bad thing, I think, is part of our genetics. We remember the embarrassments, we remember the failures, we remember the things that are happening to us, we remember the anxieties, we get overwhelmed and we dwell on the anxieties. We can all admit the reality that's going on right now across around the other side of the world in Ukraine. We hear the news, which is also kind of hammering home the difficulties, and we can get on Facebook or social media. We can see the amazingly heart-wrenching stories that are happening to people and that are being offered up for the public. We get all of this. And then on top of that, we're experiencing the high prices of gas, right? I mean, you're driving down the road, you see suddenly, I thought it was just $2, a couple of weeks ago, $2.29. Now it's $4, $4.09, $4.19 if you're doing just unleaded gas. And some people are complaining. That's right. I've gotten on the neighborhood app and Nextdoor app, and there's a lot of complaining going on about that. And then others are saying, we're doing our part to help those by suffering, that we kind of suffer. And I'm thinking, like, are we really suffering? Are we really? I'm sorry about the inconvenience. But I get it. I do get it. I know it's a lot more expensive. You're literally paying twice the amount that you were paying before. Are we really suffering? But we get caught up in that kind of stuff. We get caught up in the anxiety. We get caught up in the inconvenience. We get caught up in the obstacles that we face. We have so many freedoms, and yet we sort of forget about all of these things. We do the same thing when things discomfort us. When we find that we're uncomfortable with people of the same sex loving one another, for example, right? And I'm speaking about us universally, not us necessarily in here, but we see that kind of discomfort. We see that discomfort around people who claim certain rights because they're rights, like gun ownership or I could probably name a whole bunch of other hot button issues, and they're not coming to my mind right now. But we want to control these things, right? Because we're uncomfortable. And so we rally around our fear as opposed to what connects us. And as I said last week, and I'll say throughout this series, sin is less about what we do wrong and more about what we are failing to do right. If we think of sin really as this existential disconnect between us and life, or between life and life, if we think of that, then really what's happening is we're falling prey to so many ways, so many invitations to be disconnected as opposed to pursuing connection. So someone says, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Or someone says, Tom, the money isn't the root of all evil, it's people who are evil. And so that's the problem. And so then I wonder, well, is that what Jesus is really saying in this particular passage? Was he really saying that evil is the people? It's not money. Go ahead and have all the money you want. That's not the problem. It's people that are a problem. On the one hand, it sort of sounds like that. On the other hand, though, I'm thinking there's something else here. And I'm not going to quibble with the fact that money does get in the way. I'm not going to quibble with that. Jesus spent most of his time kind of giving away, helping the poor, living in the midst of the poor, hanging out with the marginalized, sacrificing himself. His disciples did that. But the reality, too, is there were a lot of people who followed him around that were, in fact, wealthy. There were a lot of people who followed him around that were, in fact, powerful. So it was a pretty diverse group that's hanging out. There were women hanging out with Jesus, following the disciples, all of them in that crowd. What else was going on that Jesus was saying that really you miss the point if you get focused on the obstacle that's in your eye right now, which is the money. And for some of you, and for some of us, and for me, that can be an obstacle. It can totally disconnect us from life. It can totally, how do I say this? I'm not sure how to say it. We're dead in the bed and we don't even know it, right? We can get there. We can be there. Money can be a part of that. Our fear and our anxiety about our rights can be a part of that. Our discomfort with who other people are and how they live and what they do can be a part of that. Not necessarily because it's wrong or right, because it misses the point, right? The point is we're disconnected. So to get a better look at what Jesus is talking about and what I want to think about with you is this idea of hedonic treadmill. You know what I mean by hedonic treadmill? Some of you have heard this phrase before. So the hedonic treadmill is basically this way of life that we lead that's sort of always looking for more. It's always looking for the next thing. We're always looking for the next sort of feel-good thing. Or if we're uncomfortable, looking for the next way to get comfortable. The most obvious thing is this idea that when we get used to something feeling good, or we get used to something that we've earned a certain salary range or a certain home that we've had, we're already satisfied with it. But it can be emotion. It can be an emotion that we feel with our loved one, with a partner, with an experience. And after a while, it's not enough, right? We sort of need something more. So this hedonic treadmill is this idea that we're always needing something else. And there's always obstacles that get in the way because that's what we're living on. We're living on this treadmill. So we think that when something happens, it's a problem. And why is it a problem? Because we're on the treadmill. We're in this way of life. We're living this way of life. It's an obstacle. We're attached to these things, and now there's this obstacle that's trying to get me unattached. But we're attached to the wrong things, right? We're attached to these objects. We're not attached to life. We're not attached to one another. We're not attached to the moments that we're in. Instead, we're on this hedonic treadmill. Here's a nice way I can think about this. And I figured this out yesterday when I was helping DeAndrea Dare, who's in the back. You showed up. You and your family. So nice to see you all here. So she was out there early in the morning. She had the audacity to to request that I help her out at 6:30 in the morning when it was 24 degrees and set up a sound system for her 5K charity race. So I agreed. It was supposed to be like 60 in the morning, right? Who knew it was going to be 24 degrees in the morning? I called her at night the night before, and I said, you know, if it were 40 degrees, I would have already canceled this race. So I showed up. I noticed something. You know, once the sun came out, it was kind of getting nice. It was beautiful. It was about 36 degrees, but there were a couple hundred runners out there and their families and all. And it was interesting because everyone was smiling. And of course, we're there because we're there for one another, having experienced loss of a child, right? And so it's a painful reality, while at the same time we are celebrating. We are celebrating memories, but we are also celebrating life, and they're together. You see the difference? There's an obstacle. What's breaking up that obstacle? What's completely ignoring the obstacle? The pain, the suffering, the reality of death. It's connection. We're there for one another. It's connection. Maybe the rich young man couldn't be there for people. Maybe that's his problem. Maybe that was it. He just couldn't be connected because he had too many obstacles. Then I noticed something else because I was walking around, and I don't know about how many of you cycle or how many of you run, but the worst thing in the world about cycling, you know what it is? Other cyclists, yeah, that's true. Yeah, it'd be nice if there was nobody else on the road. It's the headwind. If you're riding against the headwind, you are miserable. And even the most disciplined are sitting here going like, all right, I got to plow through this headwind. When's the path going to change? When am I going to have the wind to my back? And then eventually the wind gets to your back. And you're like, all right, this feels great. Or you're turning and you're going back the other way. You're thinking about how wonderful this is going to be. And then you're riding along. Guess what you remembered? Within a couple of minutes, you already forget the wind at your back. You're just riding along, taking advantage of things and enjoying yourself. But if that headwind comes back up again, how miserable it is. You're just feeling terrible. And I noticed everybody running yesterday was like there's no wind at all. So it was perfect for them, right? And it made me think how much headwinds and tailwinds affect us. And that's the problem we find ourselves in, is we find ourselves forgetting about all of the wonderful things or all of the joys, or as Ross Gay, the African-American writer who wrote in his book of Delight, as he said, you know, when do you go looking for delight? In the worst moments, because that's when we need delight the most. That's when it changes our moments the most, instead of the obstacle and focusing on that. And so this idea of headwinds and tailwinds has a lot to do with how we find ourselves on the hedonic treadmill. The reason why we go for these things that are the headwinds, the reason why we remember them is because of what's called availability bias, right? Our brains are attuned to dealing with conflict. That's our natural stance. So we're ready to face conflicts. The problem with that is that after a while, we tend to only see the conflicts, and we tend to sort of glide along unconsciously when everything's going fine, until something's not quite fine. We admit. Some of you remember the Louis C.K. bit that he did on TV some years ago. I thought it was funny. I don't know what you think about Louis C.K., and we all think about that. But he did this funny routine that I thought was amazing, and it speaks to the truth. I'm going to say it. He was flying on a flight some years back when they introduced internet on the flight. Some of you remember this. And so he was like, this is amazing. I can watch YouTubes, I can watch the videos, and then they announced this new internet. Everybody can tap into it. And about 5 minutes into the internet, they're up in the air and they're flying along, and the internet stops. And there's an announcement over the plane that says, sorry, we've lost our connection here. We're going to try to figure this out, but we've lost it. And he's looking over at the guy next to him who had just been saying how wonderful this was. He looks over at the guy next to him and he's going like, this sucks. And Louis C.K. made this wonderful comment. He says, you know, how quickly we forget the gifts and suddenly think of them as what we deserve, when 10 minutes prior to that, we didn't even know it existed. How often do we do that in our own lives in big ways and small ways? We're still on this hedonic treadmill that's always looking for what's comfortable, what's next, and it's always getting caught up in the obstacles or the headwinds and forgetting all the wonderful tailwinds that are at our back. Greed is, I think, what drives this, but it's really not, again, it's not so much that we're greedy. And I'm not trying to get you off the hook, because we do get caught up. We do get attached to stuff. But when we label it as greed, it makes it too easy either to label it and stick it over there or to feel bad about it and get caught up in that too. When all the while gratitude is right there in the midst of that saying, let's be thankful. What are you thankful about? How can you reflect thankfulness and gratitude and generosity and kindness in the world in all our moments, even in the most difficult moments? How can we possibly do that? Did you realize that, for example, they both share the same word? Now, the same root word. Now, if you know me, you know that I only do sermons about words that share the same root. I've been doing this for years, right? I've been telling you about all these words that share the same root. You're going like, nah, not greed and gratitude. They do not share the same root word. That makes no sense. They're contradictory items. They're dualisms, right? No, they are in each other, just like we are, just like all of life is. They share the same root. Now, they have different roots. Over the years, over the centuries, words get changed. They get reaffected, reappropriated. But if you go back to their earliest Indo-European roots, you will find that they both mean to favor something. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. What are we paying attention to? What are we favoring, right? If we think about that, they're the same thing. It's a matter of degree, and it's an invitation to transform when you really think about it. So they both share the same word root. So I want you to take just a quick minute. Think about something you're grateful for. Just take a minute, think about it, something you're grateful for. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to guess a lot of you, certainly when this question gets asked to a lot of people, a lot of you may have thought about family. A lot of you may have thought about nice home. Some of you are unpacking it a little bit more and you're thinking about great music. Being here on Sundays, I'm having this space. But now keep plowing in a little deeper. Are you grateful for the chairs you have to sit in? Are you grateful for the guy that's speaking in front of you? I'm grateful for you all for lots of different reasons. Are you grateful for the fact that at the very beginning you got to laugh? In spite of what's going on in our world right now, you laughed. Did you remember that? Because if you just came in here and we just talked about the reality, it'd be pretty depressing. We laughed. Were we being crude? Were we being rude? Are we ignoring the reality of pain and suffering in the world? We laughed. I read something by one of my favorite authors, blog writers named The Thoughtful Pastor. She's hard sometimes. She really hits things hard sometimes. Christy Thomas up in Denton. But I love what she writes because it causes me to have to deal with some extremes. Sometimes I think she's way off too far. And other times I think she's just right on the money. And I think I have to deal with this. I have to what's bothering me about what she's saying, right? And she had this wonderful deal that she did this last time where she talked I say wonderful, it was painful. She talked about having just watched a video of a woman who was struggling with her family in a bomb shelter and really afraid and just dealing with the reality of survival. And then as she started to unpack that, she said, every morning I'm waking up and I'm making bread. It's a new ritual. I've even worked on how to grow the leaven to get it to rise, and I do my own yeast. And she said, and it's become a ritual I do every morning. And as I was baking the bread this morning, I was thinking about who's not baking bread this morning, who's not participating in their kitchen this morning. And she said she broke down, just had to start crying. And then as she did further, she started to imagine herself why people bake bread. Because they feel connected to something. And they share what they feel connected to. And so in addition to supporting and providing whatever support she can through UMCOR and other things, she just imagined kind of what Sharon was doing today. Taking an opportunity to say something grateful and delightful and to try to wish for that for everyone. She can't fix everything in the world. She can practice being grateful and sharing that gratitude. And sometimes that also requires that we suffer with others some. It was painful for me to hear that because it requires sometimes that we see ourselves facing these obstacles of anxiety. And how do we breathe through it? How do we live through it? How do we move through it? How do we relate to it? I want to tell you a quick story. St. Patrick came back to Ireland after being gone for a number of centuries, was there in the 5th century, but he came back after he died. He was determined to prove to the rest of the world and all the rest of the gods in the universe, because there are all sorts of gods, Hindu and Buddhist and all these other gods, and he was determined to prove to them that Christians were the best people in the world, the kindest people in the world. And so he went back to Ireland because he thought the people of Ireland had proved him to be even better and kinder than anybody. I mean, after all, he was a slave in Scotland. He escaped to Ireland. Ireland welcomed him. They changed and they converted to Christianity. Then he went back to Scotland and converted those folks back to Christianity. And so he went to Scotland to find a good, kind person. He said, "There's got to be him." And he determined that the way he would do it was he endowed his finger with magical powers so that he could point at something and offer somebody something amazing. A golden stone instead of a rock, a diamond jewel instead of a crystal piece of glass. So everywhere he would go, he would stop someone. He'd say, "Hello, it's good to see you. I wonder if I could offer you something." And then he'd point down the ground, and people would see something appear. Now, in his mind, he was sure, being kind, they would not accept the gift because it wasn't theirs. If anything, they'd find out where could they take that and help other people with the money from it. But what he found instead was that every time he offered it, someone would snatch it up. They'd thank the old man, and they'd walk away. Every time he found someone, he offered them something, pointed to the ground, turned into a stone, turned into a jewel, turned into a golden goblet. The people thanked him for it, and they walked away, took it with them. St. Patrick was so disturbed. He was so disappointed. He climbed to a top of the mountain. Some of you have been there because we went there at the end of our trip, Croagh Patrick, the mountain in the west of Ireland. We hiked up the top of that, a miserable hike, and we hiked up there. It's a pilgrimage. That was the last spot where he was. He's supposed to have disappeared from that spot. But just before disappearing, he heard whistling coming up the hill that day. He looked over and he saw a small boy was walking up there whistling, just a young boy. And he thought to himself, well, the one thing I haven't asked is children, the innocent, the kindest, the most innocent of all. Such belong to the kingdom of heaven, he thought. And so he saw the little boy, pointed his finger to the ground. Some golden stones appeared. Some glass marbles appeared. The boy's eyes filled with delight. St. Patrick said, "I suppose you're wanting to pick up some of those things and take them home." The boy said, "No, I don't." St. Patrick said, "Well, you're greedy then. I suppose you want more." And he started pointing to more things and turned them to gold and turned a bush to gold. Turned a rabbit to gold. It fell over on the side like a hard rock. And the boy said, "You didn't have to do that." St. Patrick couldn't convince the lad. He says, "You don't want anything?" The boy smiled and said, "Not exactly." St. Patrick scowled. He said, "Well, then what?" And he grabbed St. Patrick's hand and says, "I'll take your magic finger." It seems greedy on the one hand. On the other hand, though, what was Jesus really saying to the rich young man? Was he really saying, you have to give everything up? Or what was he saying but that how can you connect in every way with people around you in such a way that you're experiencing delight in your relationships with life itself, in your relationships with one another, in your relationships with people who disagree with you and differ with you? Hey, Brad, I'll invite you guys to come on up here as I finish up. How in the world is it possible for us to celebrate life, or as Ross Gay would say, to find delight even in the most difficult moments? How can we do that? And so my suggestion to us as we think about finding gratitude where there's greed, finding joy and opportunity and invitation where we face these obstacles of anxiety or fear or discomfort. This morning when I woke up, my alarms didn't go off. I was late to everything. 5 alarms set. None of them went off because I guess the computer decided when time changes, you have to reset your alarms. None of them worked. Linda was sick. She wasn't getting up and helping. Our son who just wrecked his truck, I'm sorry, Stoley's. We bought a used truck from them. He totaled his truck the other day. So there was that. He's sleeping on the couch. The dog must have been wanting something when she was scraping at my door at about 6:30 in the morning, which I ignored because when I woke up, there was a mess up and down the hallway. All of this happened, and I was like, okay. And I first wanted to get upset because, man, my day was going bad, and I hadn't even got started, and I just started to laugh and smile to myself and to take a deep breath because you realize it's going to be okay. There's delight in all these moments. When I got here, Mickey says, the air conditioner's not working. I was like, well, of course it's not. Why would you expect it to? And in fact, why would you expect anything to go the way you want it to? Really? Right? Why do you expect that? Get off the hedonic treadmill. Start to look for joy in the moments. Start to look for little ways to be surprised. As Mary Oliver would say, catch somebody off guard and say, did you notice this? Or maybe when you're just talking to them, instead of their rudeness or their anger or their frustration, look for something in them that you can help them see. Oh yeah, right now you think it's all about protecting this shell, but in fact, there's something joyful trying to get out. Can't see it right now. Let me see if I can help you. Right? That's what we're invited to be about. That's really what the gratitude in the heart of greed is saying. So when the old man went up the hill years and years and years ago in Japan, he lived in a small hut, and thieves came and robbed him that night and took everything he had, which wasn't much to begin with, and left him half naked as they went down during the cold night, sitting at the top of the hill there, watching those thieves go back down. He smiled to himself because just then he'd noticed the moon coming up over the trees. And he said, if you'll come back, I'll let you take this view with you. Amen.